You are told to be efficient. You are told that the goal of your life is to optimize every variable, to maximize the yield of every hour, to squeeze the maximum profit from every dollar. The modern world worships the straight line. We believe that if we can just remove all the friction, all the waste, and all the redundancy, we will finally be rich. We will finally be safe. Look at the deep, ancient jungle. It is not efficient. It is tangled. There are plants there that seem to serve no purpose. There is rot. Yet, the jungle has survived for 50 million years. It has survived meteors, ice ages, and fires. Now, look at the cornfield planted by man. It is perfect. It is efficient. Every stalk is identical. Every inch of soil is used for maximum output. It is a machine made of biology. But because it is efficient, it is fragile. One virus, one drought, one swarm of locusts, and the entire field dies in a single week. Nature hates efficiency. Nature loves redundancy. Nature knows that the straight line is a lie because the world is not straight. The world is a storm. And when you optimize your life for a straight line, when you maximize your debt to buy the bigger house, when you specialize in only one skill to get the higher salary, you are building a cornfield. You are building a life that is designed to fail the moment the weather changes. 700 years ago, the great historian Ibn Khaldun sat in the deserts of North Africa and diagnosed this very sickness. He did not call it optimization. He called it the senility of the dynasty. He observed that when a civilization moves from the harsh desert to the comfortable city, it becomes obsessed with luxury and refinement. The desert tribes had asabiya, rugged social cohesion. They were generalists. They knew how to fight, how to build, how to survive. They were redundant. But as they settled in the cities, they specialized. They became efficient. They hired mercenaries to fight for them. They hired farmers to feed them. They removed the friction of survival. Ibn Khaldun warned that this ease was not progress. It was the beginning of the end. He wrote that the comfort of the city breeds a softness in the soul. The specialized man becomes dependent on the system. And when the system shakes, when the famine comes or the invaders arrive, the efficient man has no defense. He has optimized himself for a world that no longer exists. You feel this ancient warning in your bones today, do you not? You are the anxious high achiever. On paper, you are winning. You have the title. Here, the portfolio. You have the optimized schedule, but you cannot sleep. You feel a low-level hum of terror in your chest because your soul knows what your spreadsheet does not. Your soul knows that you are a monoculture. You have stripped away the redundancy of your life to maximize your income. You have sacrificed your hobbies because they don't pay. You have neglected your friendships because they take time. You have leveraged your assets to the hilt because debt is efficient. You are walking a tightrope over a canyon, and you have sold your safety net to buy a nicer pair of shoes. You are terrified because you know that one stumble, one market crash, one diagnosis, one shift in AI technology, and it is all over. You are built a machine, but you are living in a jungle. We must stop acting like machines. We must stop worshiping the God of ROI. We must start acting like the ecosystem. We must pivot from the philosophy of the cornfield to the philosophy of the rainforest. This is not about giving up success. It is about changing the definition of success from maximum height to maximum roots. The first shift is to return to the barbell. Nature does not like the middle. Nature likes the extremes. You must structure your wealth like the camel stores water. You must hold assets that are seemingly inefficient. Cash that earns 0 interest is not a waste. It is oxygen. Gold that sits in a vault doing nothing is not a dead rock. It is insurance against the madness of crowds. You must stop trying to make every dollar work for you. Let some dollars sleep. Let them sit idle. This waste is the buffer that saves you when the winter comes. It gives you the power to stand still when others are forced to sell. The second shift is the cultivation of the useless. In the modern world, we only value what we can sell. We commodify our hobbies into side hustles. We turn our dinners into networking. This is a poison. We must reclaim the redundancy of skills that have no price tag. Learn to build a chair. Learn to grow a tomato. Learn to fight. Okay? These skills will not increase your quarterly bonus. Okay? But they will increase your soul's density. They remind you that you can manipulate the physical world, that you are not just a brain in a jar waiting for a direct deposit. When the digital world evaporates, the man who can build a fire is the king. The final shift is the reconstruction of a sepia. Efficient relationships are transactional. You give me this, I give you that. But resilient relationships are irrational. They are based on shared sacrifice, not shared profit. You must invest time in people who cannot help your career. You must build a tribe that will carry you when your leg is broken, not just when your stock is up. This is the ultimate hedge. The lone wolf is efficient, but the pack is immortal. The roots of the trees in the forest are tangled together. Okay? They share nutrients in the dark. Hey? That is why they stand when the hurricane blows. The storm is coming. It always comes. The era of the easy, straight line is ending. The cornfields will be flattened by the wind, but the jungle will breathe. The jungle will drink the rain. Do not fear the inefficiency. Do not fear the slack. Brace the tangle. Embrace the buffer. It is the only thing that is real. If you wish to see the world clearly when others are blind, and if you seek the wisdom of the ancients to navigate the storms of tomorrow, subscribe to Mind in Motion. Let us walk this path of resilience together.